Thank you, Dali. Gustavo, obrigado pelo convite. Eu devo dizer a todos que tivemos um debate grande no painel se deveríamos falar em português ou inglês. Mas eu pedi permissão, já que a Grace participou do painel em inglês, e eu acho que ela deveria ter a resposta, eu vou continuar em inglês doravante. Grace, I shall make it in English for us to discuss a bit too. Not discuss, just see some ideas here. I had some slides, but after what I heard from you, maybe I can change and talk a bit more. First of all, I'd like to say that I am convinced that Brazil, if it were for the transfer pricing rules, Brazil is very close to what OECD would require. I'm convinced that we have here in Brazil, I don't know how to do this. I'm convinced that we are adopting arm's length principle. I'm convinced that Brazilian transfer pricing rules is not that different from what you have in the OECD. We look for comparables. Comparables is not something which really exists. Comparables are always built. The problem is that how you build your comparables. You may do it on a deep analysis. You may do it through predetermined margins. Provided predetermined margins are rebuttable, it's not that different. The methods are very similar. So I don't see this as a big problem. When you see our rules here, and the slides, I'm just jumping the slides because it's not very, very relevant now. The problem which we should discuss is how we get to these margins. How Brazilian legislator got to these margins and whether we can or not change the margins we are presently adopting. I hope this work is being done in Brazil. I'm not aware of this, but this is the question. I have here another table here, which should be. The problem which I've seen the practice is that industries don't really know in which margins they are because they don't know how these margins were achieved. So what we need as a change in our legislation is to make it clear who is in which margins and why, and how to challenge the margins. Provided you have this is really not that different. I'm saying this because today, the early session, the political session, I heard several times the word legal certainty. And this is a very important issue, legal certainty. Dali talked today about a boat. He said a ship. OECD is a ship. And the ship moves very slowly. The problem we may have now is that if OECD happens to accept Brazil, whether the ship will change because Brazil will be there. Because OECD will no longer be a club of rich members. There will be some giants there. Brazil is a giant, which is not exactly a rich member. So the accession of Brazil to OECD might mean a change in the OECD. And this could be very positive, not only for Brazil, but also for OECD, because we should consider our problems. I'm convinced that if I were an investor, if I were to live in Europe and were to invest in South America, if I had two choices, fairness and legal certainty, fairness, legal certainty, I would say I prefer legal certainty. I'm convinced that having these margins may represent legal certainty for an investor. He knows the price for doing business in Brazil. He doesn't need to know, well, maybe I will negotiate with some tax authorities to reach some APA, or I may not reach the APA because I'm discussing with legal authorities of another country, another continent. It's very easy to talk about APAs when you're talking about European countries among themselves, developed countries among themselves. When you want to be, as OECD happens to wish to be, a world organization, you should go further and consider different environments. And in this sense, the more you have rules, the more you have clarity about the rules, the better you can attract real investments. So I would urge you in your conversations to talk about transparency, to say investors must know in which of these classes they are, how these numbers were reached, and how to challenge the numbers. But provided you have this, I cannot see that we are very different from what you have in the OECD. Therefore, I would even say that position of Brazilian government, that there is no contradiction between Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention and the Brazilian legislation, might be deemed to be correct, provided some changes are made on how you reach the margins. This might be the issue. Another issue which we should discuss, and I'm trying to do it in a very short period, is, well, of course, sorry, there are other differences. I don't know how relevant these are, because really we have the problem of the royalties. Brazil has no transfer pricing rules for royalties. Should we have it or not? When I see the international literature on intangibles and transfer pricing problems in intangibles, I'm sure that Brazil has no good solution for this. But I'm really not sure that OECD has reached a good solution for royalties. So I'd say this is a problem for both sides. This product, well, there are some other differences here which I'm not getting here. So talking about the main challenges, I would say that the one is the question of practicability, and to say that having predetermined margins is not a bad position. Dali, you're supposed to talk about the UN positions. That's why I'm quoting UN here, to quote the UN manual, in which they kind of accept the Brazilian position, the predetermined margins. It is not seen as something very bad because it's practical. For developing countries with short resources for administration, having practical solutions, having predetermined margins, seem to be a good solution. The problem is transparency. The problem is how you reach the margins, as I mentioned. I don't know. For instance, we saw the classes there, so 20, 30, and 40%. I had a concrete case, in which there was a company which produces packing, paper packing. And they wanted to know whether they are in the paper sector or whether they are in a different sector. What does paper sector mean? Does packing is included in paper or not? You don't know in which class you are, and this may be a problem. The question of the predetermined margins and the presumptions. This should be said presently, although our legislation already provides for the possibility of challenging the margins, of saying the margins, this margin is not applicable for my sector, the reality is that presently it is impossible to reach a different margin. But this is not a problem of the law, this is a problem of administration. Brazilian administration must simply revoke this ruling and say that they will accept any challenge of margins independent of this ruling, which is really very complex. Maybe here I should mention that we in Brazil already have for our VAT a very interesting system for challenging margins. Our VAT, we call here Substituição Tributária. In our VAT system, industries may apply for margins for their sectors. They present their researches. This research is examined by governments, and government and industry altogether shall reach a consensus on an applicable margin. This is a system which is already working in Brazil. So it's quite clear for me that we still have in our federal sector, in transfer pricing, we still have this ruling, instead of simply instead of simply accepting, please bring me your margins, please bring me your researches as an industry, and we will study this. This can be done. We don't need to change our law for having rebuttable margins. Finally, the issue of the map. Maybe if you would want to ask, what is the most relevant issue we may have here? I think it's map. I mean, once you have the predetermined margins, you will solve most of the problems. But there will still be the one company which, although in the whole in its sector, in the industry, this margin would be okay. For this one company, this margin or this price is not okay. So we must be prepared for the map. And I can see no problem in adopting maps in Brazil. As a matter of fact, and certainly I'd really hear to hear from you, Grace, from what you heard, because I heard from tax officials that already there are some maps happening in Brazil. But unfortunately, I heard this from some friends. I didn't read this in the papers. And I think this is the main mistake of Brazilian authorities. If they are signing maps, they should put this in all papers. Everybody should be aware that Brazil is adopting maps, because maps are the solution for our transfer pricing issues. I think that every single map should be announced and known in the papers. Yes, we have maps. Yes, we are for maps. Because when you see what is a map? Map is simply saying, notwithstanding what you have in your law, we, administrations, we agree that according to the treaty, this price is arm's length. I think I have here a slide for this. Yes. The issue is the following. Arm's length is not a price. Arm's length is a range. So, assuming a range, you have here M1 to M6 as arm's length prices. The fact that Brazil says M1, M2, and M3 are the prices I accept, and these prices are arm's length, this may be true, but it is still true that M4, M5, and M6 are also arm's length. So the issue is not to say that Brazilian legislation is not arm's length. The issue is another one, whether Brazilian legislation exhausts what arm's length is, whether Brazil is prepared to accept that beyond its legislation, there are other prices which are also arm's length. This is the object of the map. So in the map, Brazil would simply say, although according to my legislation, M4 is not foreseen, according to the treaty, any arm's length price is acceptable, and M4 is acceptable. So if I negotiate with Holland here that M4 is also arm's length, I agree that my legislation is not applicable. So it is irrelevant what my legislation says, provided that M4 is arm's length. So I'm saying this because I hear from several tax administrations in Brazil, they say, come on, we must apply our law. If we only have M1, M2, and M3, how can we accept M4? And the answer is, you must not apply your law, because you may only apply your law if, according to the treaty, your law is applicable. And if the company is adopting M4, M4 is an arm's length price, your law is simply not applicable. So a map has nothing to do with interpreting internal law. A map has nothing to do with not applying internal law. A map has only to do to accept, two countries to accept that M4 is a arm's length price, and if one country adopts M4, it is within Article 9. This would be a very important step forward in the Brazilian administration from now on. Dali, I promised you to do it in 15 minutes, and that's what I did in 13 minutes.
You did fantastic. You did absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.